today Nat is going to present on, what are you presenting on?
I'm presenting on the Arab Spring today. Have you heard of the Arab Spring before?
Never.
Okay, so so the reason I chose this topic for the first episode I wanted to cover for season 2 world history, I wanted to focus on the Middle East because I really don't know anything about the Middle East. I have so many questions and so many things to learn. So I knew I wanted to focus on the Middle East. And the topic I'm covering today is actually super recent. Like it happened in 2011. So it's I don't know, it's not like super far back in history, but I think for people who are not really sure about, like, they don't understand current events going on in the Middle East today, this event kind of explains what why the Middle East looks like it does today. So, yeah. So, okay, so do you also what do you know about what's happening in the Middle East today? Like, do you know?
Sure. Yeah, I know a little bit because one of my good friends is Syrian, and so he explained to me the situation in Syria.
Yeah.
So I think they're just like a bunch of like they didn't like the government in Syria, and so a bunch of different rebel groups did like a coup d'etat, but there's a lot of different rebel groups, so then everyone's kind of just fighting for position of power and control, and so that has wreaked havoc in Syria, and that's why it's like war torn.
Mhm.
That's what I know.
No, yeah, actually, I'll be talking about, yeah, there's like a civil war going on there, and it's connected to the Arab Spring. So I'll be going into more detail about that. But yeah. So Syria, that's it's like the biggest refugee crisis currently. So yeah, okay. So I'm just gonna go right in. So a brief description of what the Arab Spring is. Basically, it was a series of pro-democracy revolutions that began in the spring of 2011 in largely Muslim and Arabic speaking countries in North Africa and the Middle East. So to list the countries that were affected by the Arab Spring, there's a lot. So Tunisia, Morocco, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Bahrain, Algeria, Jordan, Oman, Iraq, Sudan, and Lebanon. So it's like a huge amount of countries were swept up in this movement. There are widespread protests and revolutions, and it was all within a very short time period.
Question, is this so when people talk about the Middle East conflict, is this all stemming from the Arab Spring, or are they separate things happening?
Well, the thing is, so the Middle East, there's a lot of conflict and war and violence going on. The Arab Spring is one of the events that has stemmed from this conflict. So
Okay.
it's not the first uprising revolt. It was caused by people who are unhappy with authoritarian governments, and violence that was happening in their own country. But yeah, it's part, and then you'll see that it fuels even more violence in the end. So it's kind of just a cycle of people are really unhappy with their government. They revolt, a new government is put in power, but then it falls apart and then they revolt again. So there's just been a lot of turmoil in the area. Um yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So the Arab Spring, it all began in December of 2010 in Tunisia when a 26-year-old street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi was harassed and publicly humiliated by police because he didn't have a permit to sell his fruits and vegetables. And yeah, they harassed him violently, and he was obviously really upset. So he tried to complain about his mistreatment to local authorities, but they wouldn't listen to him. They were like, whatever, leave us alone. And so in an act of protest, Bouazizi set himself on fire outside of the local governor's office. Yeah, and obviously he passed away. And so this yeah, so this his death sparked outrage amongst the rest of people in Tunisia because there were there was a huge, I guess, gap between the government and the working class people, and the working class people were suffering through a lot of economic hardships, and they were so upset that this man was treated so poorly just because he didn't have a permit. So they're like enraged, and so protests broke out in the streets of the capital, Tunis, and on January 14th, so like a few weeks later, the authoritarian president. Okay, I'm probably gonna mispronounce all these names, so I apologize.
It's okay.
There's a lot of difficult names, but Zain Al Abidine Ben Ali, he abdicated his position and he fled the country after 23 years of rule. So like this is a huge deal because they had this awful like dictator who had been ruling for decades, and because of these protests, like in a matter of like a couple weeks, he was removed from power. Also, okay, before I continue, just a fair warning, I'm going to be covering a lot of different countries and a lot of different names of leaders. So if you get confused now, like just interrupt me and I can clarify. But yeah, I'm going to be like bouncing around. So,
Okay. It
uh,
makes sense so far. It's good.
okay, yeah. So he's removed from office, right? And so it was like a successful protest, right? They wanted him gone and then he left. So social media, because this is 2011, right? So social media has a huge influence on the movement because people from Tunisia were posting photos and videos of their successful uprising. And these images inspired activists in other countries nearby to fight for more social freedoms and more participation in the political process. So all of a sudden, we see similar movements all across the region in like a really short period of time. So again, I'm going to list the countries just really quick. So we obviously Tunisia. There's also Morocco, Syria, Libya, Egypt, Bahrain, Algeria, Jordan, Oman, Iraq, Sudan, and Lebanon. So a huge amount of countries. And obviously, I don't have enough time to cover the protests in every single one of these movements. So instead, I'll just be focusing on a few of these countries, especially those that had regime changes because of the protests. But I encourage everyone, again, to do further research. So first, I'm going to talk about Egypt. So on January 2nd, mass protests began in Cairo, which is the capital, and they lasted for 18 days, and they brought together tens of thousands of people. So it's huge crowds. And then a month later, on February 11th, President Hosni Mubarak is removed from office, and he had been ruling the country for 30 years. So he was a really violent dictator. So people had been having a lot of issues with him. They obviously like did not like his regime.
When you say removed, is it peacefully removed or coup d'etat, or did they step down?
Um, yeah, he was forcefully removed. I
Okay.
yeah, by the military. I believe. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
forcefully removed. It's not. He doesn't want to leave, but he loses public support, and then he loses the support of the military, which is like a really big deal.
Hmm.
And so the military takes over temporarily because there's like no leader, right? They had removed Mubarak from office and now they need to step up. And in 2012, they had elections and they voted Mohamed Morsi. They voted him into office as president. However, a year after he was sworn into office, he is also removed through a military coup. Um, so he only was serving for a year, and then the military overthrows him. And the defense minister at the time, his name is Abdel Fattah el Sisi, and he becomes president. And he's still in power today. So this was in 2012, and he still is the president of Egypt today. And he's a very violent authoritarian leader. The government of Egypt is like not so great. It's not really great over there right now. And so tens of thousands of peaceful activists and critics of El Sisi's government remain in jail today, and hundreds of them have been sentenced to death. So there's virtually like no freedom of speech. And yeah, so I'm gonna get back into the aftermath of Egypt later. We'll set that aside. For now, I'm gonna continue on to some countries that they broke out into civil war because of the Arab Spring. So first, I'm going to talk about Libya. So in the summer of 2011, a civil war outbreaks, and this is like because of all the protests that had been inspired by the Arab Spring. And in October of 2011, the authoritarian dictator Muammar Gaddafi, I don't know if you've ever heard of Gaddafi, he's like talked about a lot here, but he is overthrown during an extremely violent civil war. He's tortured and he's literally dragged through the streets, and he's executed by opposition fighters. And there is, because of social media, like people were recording these incidents. So video footage of his death was shared on social media and was seen by millions of people online. Yeah, so Gaddafi is overthrown, obviously, and then even though he was overthrown, Libya still remains in a state of civil war. Um, Basically, yeah, there are two rival governments that are both claiming authority over the country. All sides have committed war crimes and serious human rights abuses, and the people of Libya have suffered terribly through political upheaval, and they have to survive like violence on the streets, as well as limited access to food and resources and healthcare services. And because of this, thousands of people have fled the country, mostly by boat, and they are going to Europe, to other parts of Europe. And so it's like an ongoing refugee crisis. And again, I'll go into more detail in a bit. Yemen is also still currently in a civil war that has its roots in the Arab.
Yemen's a pretty young country, aren't they? They're only like 50 or 60 years old too.
I think so. Yeah.
I just know this because I had a teacher whose daughter went to Yemen and came back and brought us hummus and like pita bread, and then told us about Yemen. So
Wow.
yeah, but it's a young country, so.
Yeah, okay. I honestly don't know much about the history before the Arab Spring, but that's good. Yeah, I didn't realize it was such a young country. But yeah, so they're still in a civil war. And so basically also in 2011, another longtime authoritarian president, his name was Ali Abdullah Saleh. He's overthrown. And then oh gosh, okay. Abdullah Mansour Hadi, he assumes power. And so political tensions they continue to grow. Different groups are fighting for control over the country. And one of these groups is known as the Houthis, which represent the Shia Muslim minority. So just as a refresher, there are basically two major denominations of Islam. It's Shia and Sunni. And so in a lot of these countries in the Middle East, like there's one major, or like one dominant denomination. Does that make sense? So
Yeah, denomination.
yeah, like largely Sunni Muslim or like largely Shia Muslim. So
Oh, okay.
the minority Shia Muslims, and they start taking control over territories in Yemen. And in early 2015, they actually overtook the capital of Sana'a. And so they're, oh gosh, the Houthis, the rebel group, and then security forces, like military forces who were loyal to the original dictator that had been overthrown, Saleh. So they joined forces together, and they forced the current president, Hadi, his name is Hadi, they forced him to flee the country in March 2015. And so he still is like ruling over the country. I'm pretty sure he's returned to Yemen, but they like forced him to flee the country. And so the civil war obviously is still going on today. And so foreign powers, there's a lot of foreign interference in the civil war. And basically it's like different countries are either supporting the Houthi rebels or they're supporting the Hadi government. And throughout all of this, obviously civilians are suffering from not only the violence of war, but also a huge famine in the country. So it's really upsetting.
Wow. Wait, so all of those overthrowing of the leaders, that's happening in every country in 2011?
Yeah, like basically the countries I'm highlighting. So all the countries that I listed earlier, not all of them had regime changes. Some of them were just like weren't as successful. They didn't have as much momentum, and so there were a lot of protests in these countries, but not a lot of change happened. But then, like the countries I'm talking about now, basically, like the whole country was flipped upside down. The governments were overthrown, and leaders were changed, and like it's just crazy. Like I think I said this earlier, but I was 12 at the time this happened, so I was not paying attention to what was going on. But I just like can't imagine, I don't know, like the whole region, all these governments are changing like one after another, and man, like I'm sure the people living in the region were just so like scared and like paranoid. You don't know what's gonna happen tomorrow. Like everything could change in a day.
Yeah, can you imagine if we found news that some violent rebel group overtook like our president, regardless of how you feel about the president, I'd still be concerned about that happening. So,
Right. And like these countries are smaller and they're all clustered so close together. So it's almost like I'm in Illinois now. So it's like if Wisconsin and then like Indiana and Iowa, like all of a sudden like there were
yeah.
revolutions in all these states and like you just see it one after another. It's like spreading like wildfire. So it like it's just such a chaotic time. Um and yeah, so, okay, so last I'm going to talk about Syria. So you kind of gave an overview earlier, but just a little more like details. So basically, in March 15th of 2011, there peaceful pro-democracy protests began, but they're met with government opposition. So the Syrian government killed and imprisoned these peaceful protesters. Yeah, it was like an extremely violent response, and it was obviously like horrifying. And so Syria quickly split into factions, like different groups, and violence broke out. And this was like the beginning of a civil war that continues to this day. The civil war is still going on. And so basically, with the civil war, you have the oppressive regime of longtime dictator Bashar al-Assad. So he was the president or dictator, I guess, leader, and he's still in power today. And he's fighting against rebel forces who are trying to gain control over the country. So you have, yeah, Bashar al-Assad's government and then rebel forces who want to overthrow him. And then you also have a lot of extremist groups that have come into Syria and infiltrated the country. One of these groups is ISIS, and at one point, ISIS had gained so much territory in northeastern Syria that they declared a caliphate. And a caliphate is basically a nation that's governed by Islamic law. So they had all this territory in Syria, and they were like, okay, this is our Islamic nation. Like Syria is in the news a lot today, as it should be. We should be talking about it more because it has displaced, the civil war has displaced more than half of all Syrians. So that's
Wow.
about 11 million people, and it's killed up to 500,000 people. It's the largest refugee crisis of the 21st century, and Syrians have been fleeing to seek refuge in Turkey, Greece, and other parts of Western Europe. They're not always met with like warm, welcoming arms. And so, yeah, even like yeah, they're if they stay in Syria, like they could be killed. If they leave Syria, they're like leading a very difficult life. So yeah, and
Yeah.
again, like all these civil wars that I just mentioned, like they're still going on today. I think like with COVID, we're all kind of preoccupied with that. Like that's pretty distracting, but it's also like something to remember too. That like this stuff is still going on. It's not like it gets put on pause because of a pandemic. But
Mhm.
yeah, so the aftermath of the Arab Spring, um, so all these like civil wars broke out. There were regime changes. There were successful protests, unsuccessful like revolutions, and basically Tunisia, where it started with the street vendor, Tunisia is pretty much seen as one of the only successful revolutions of the Arab Spring. That's because in October of 2011, they had their first democratic parliament elections, and then um, they drafted a new constitution, and this new constitution protects freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and it also bans torture. So it was like a lot of progress, and there are a lot of like major human rights improvements. However, it's not perfect yet. Like there have still been instances of like oh my gosh, suppression of speech by like political opponents, and there have been like journalists who have been like arrested. So it's not perfect yet, but they had a huge amount of improvement. However, like the overall movements of 2011 and the Arab Spring in general has been seen as like kind of a failure, because the original goals of these uprisings were to increase social freedoms and increase democratic participation in their governments. And sadly, protesters instead saw more war and violence, and there are now like stronger repercussions for people who speak out for a more fair and more open society. So if we ask ourselves like why did these movements fail? Like some people will argue that, oh, it's like the incompetence of the revolutionaries or like the transitional leaders. So the leaders that took over after the governments were overthrown, they're like, oh, they failed, like they didn't do a good job, they didn't know what they were doing. However, like myself and a lot of other people argue that the blame can be placed on like the failure of institutions. And so Vox is one of my sources, and they wrote a huge article about like how the failure of institutions was why the revolutions like weren't successful. And so they have a really good quote, so I'm just going to read it. So, democratic transition, it turns out, isn't about whom you can overthrow or whom you replace them with. It's about whether or how you change the vast network of institutions underneath that person. So no matter how many times you topple the dictator, no matter how pure and good your protesters are, it won't be enough. So I really like that quote. And so now, yeah, like I guess I'm gonna go into more detail about like what does that mean? Like, oh, institutions failed. Like that's kind of confusing. So if we look at first, let's look at Egypt. So just like as a refresher, because I talked about so many different names and countries. So protesters had originally overthrown the dictator Mubarak, right? And so he had been ruling for 3 decades. And over these 3 decades, he basically ensured that no opposition party or civil society institution grew strong enough to challenge him. So for example, he staffed the interior ministry with his supporters rather than like effective leaders. So like the patronage and spoil system, like we talked about. And then this made it easier, like this gave way to corruption, right? And then he stripped the judiciary system of its power, and this weakened the rule of law and gave him the power to persecute his political opponents. And so basically he made sure that all these institutions in the government were like very weak, and they couldn't support a transition if his regime fell. The only institution that grew stronger was the military. He made the military a lot stronger, and this kind of backfired because he lost public support, and then he lost the loyalty of his military. So then the military like overthrew him. And so he's overthrown, right? And then the next guy is elected. Morsi is elected into power. But he was pretty much set up for failure, because all of these institutions were like, he was starting from below ground zero, because he had to like rebuild all these institutions. Like there's corruption throughout the government, and so you kind of have to rebuild everything. And that's a really difficult task. So he failed, and instead of like democratically electing a new president, um, like there were these institutions were too weak to prevent further revolution. So he was overthrown by the military in a coup. So like, does that make sense?
Yeah. Wait, which country is this again?
This is Egypt.
Okay. Wow.
And so like, yeah, basically all these institutions were weak, and then now we still have there's still a dictator in Egypt, and it's because there's no like checks and balances, because
Hmm.
the original dictator had erased all these checks and balances. So it's hard to it doesn't matter about the people who are in power, it's about like the setup of the government.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so basically the same thing happened in Libya. Gaddafi had like been weakening institutions over his 20 years of rule, 30 years of rule. And so no one was able to challenge him. And so now Libya is in a civil war, like fighting for control because there had been no like strong opposition parties. Yeah. Like you might be asking like, "Oh my God, like why are there so many dictators?" It's because there's like a lot of instability after these after Britain and France like pulled out of the Middle East, and then there's like a strong sense of nationalism, and like it was easy for people to kind of like take power by using nationalism as like a uniting identity factor. And then also like because of oil reserves in the Middle East, like these leaders were able to make a lot of money really quick, and then they're able to like fund their like with the money they're making from oil, they're able to like pay off different institutions, so like the military, and like they're able to like bribe people and basically like fund their dictatorship. So that's another reason why we see a lot of like authoritarian regimes in the region. So
Makes sense.
yeah. So yeah. And then also like just so for Syria, so the military is really, really strong, and they have remained loyal to Bashar al-Assad because he basically engineered the military as an instrument to rule the country. So he weakened all the other institutions, made the military stronger, but he made sure that they would like always remain loyal to him and do whatever he said. And because of this, Syria is pretty much the worst case scenario because like there's a brutal evil dictator that has like a good amount of territory, and he's attacking civilians, and he remains in power, but there's also a power vacuum in the territory that he lost, and that has opened the door for ISIS and other extremist groups to infiltrate the country. So it's like that's why it's such a violent situation, and that's why it hasn't been resolved yet. It's just like literally the worst case scenario. And then, so if you're asking yourself, so why did Tunisia succeed? Why were they like the only country to succeed? Basically, their first post-revolutionary government had remained stable, and when the people started disagreeing with their leader, he was defeated in the polls rather than through a coup. Like they just voted him out of office after his term was up. And
Yeah. Did any of the other countries write constitutions?
um no, I think Bahrain they have a constitutional monarchy, and I think they tried to draft a new constitution, but I'm pretty
Yeah, I feel like writing it down helps. I'm just like studying other countries.
sure.
When you have a constitution and you write like, "Okay, this is how the government should be formed." Um, but I don't know. That's not to like diminish what happened in Egypt, but I just Tunisia had the or Tunisia, Tunisia is that
Tunisia.
yeah,
Mm.
I thought it was Tunisia. I've been saying it wrong my whole life. Tunisia, yeah, I feel like the one differing thing you told me is that Tunisia had a constitution that outlawed certain elements.
Yeah, like they were able to draft a constitution, but that's because they had stronger civil institutions before the protests began. So
Okay.
like they did have a dictator, but they still had strong like opposition,
Hmm.
and they had like human rights groups and like lawyers and like clerks like were still strong and present, and like that's a really big deal, because like those people were able to like come together and diffuse political tensions. They were able to write a new constitution, and then they were able to continue with like fair elections because they had like these strong institutions. I know I'm like repeating myself, but
No, that makes sense.
yeah.
How does one diminish the power of an institution? Do you just remove funding?
Yeah, well, like kind of like what I guess like using Egypt as an example again, like he just replaced all the government officials with his supporters, so it was like super corrupt. So there's no one who's like knows what they're doing, like no one who's like an expert at their job. It's not like the people who are like leading the country are not necessarily like the best people. They're just like people who gave him money, right? And
Yeah.
it's like so much corruption. And so now it's like, okay, we have to like fill all these government roles, but like how do we do that? And then he I guess if you replace like all your country's judges with again like supporters or like people that you could pay off, then there's no
Yeah.
judicial system. And so basically it's like you're replacing the entire government with people.
For you.
Yeah, it's like the patronage system, but like extreme.
Yeah. I guess how would you even rise up against that? Like as the people, there's no really other way than by force. If
And that's why like a lot, like if you look at these countries who are in civil wars, the reason they go into civil war is because they like rebel forces they join forces with at least part of the military, because you need that physical force. Like you can't just like protest forever.
yeah, peaceful protest is not going to work in that situation. Because if it did, then you wouldn't be in that situation. Like, obviously, that's not what the people would want.
Exactly. So a lot of times it's like, okay, well, when the military starts questioning who they're like supporting, then that's when like yeah, that's when it goes south.
Yeah.
Um yeah, so it's like super complicated. And obviously there are a lot of different reasons why certain countries succeeded and certain like most countries didn't, but that's kind of just like my oversimplification of like, oh, blame it on the institutions, but obviously there's a lot of other factors. But basically like what we learned and what we saw from the uprisings in the spring of 2011 is that like there's mass demonstrations and peaceful protests are actually really powerful and can result in change. And it really showcased the ability of social media to fuel protests and like also communicate the goals of the protesters to the outside world. I think that's kind of why it spread so quickly and it was so far reaching was because like social media, you could reach the whole world.
Hmm.
And yeah, and it's just that's basically it. Oh wait, no, yeah, also sorry. Finally, it showed autocratic governments and the rest of the world that millions of people living in Islamic nations believe in free expression and democratic governance. And yeah, basically like what started as a single act of protest from like one individual resulted in a huge movement that like spread across an entire region. And yeah, that's basically
Wow.
the Arab Spring. It's really complicated. There's a lot more,
Yeah.
but hopefully that kind of gives people like some background on what's going on today and a little bit more understanding of like why there's so much unrest. And
Yeah. No, definitely. That's like the tip of the iceberg into what's happening in the Middle East. And
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Also, like I just want to like before we end, I just want to say like I don't know. I feel like the region is extremely diverse, and like the situation varies extremely like between each country. And I kind of chose to focus on countries that like were in similar situations with like civil war and regime changes. But like that's not what all of the Middle East looks like, and it's not just all like war torn. Uh, it's not all. Not everyone is suffering, like in a similar way. Yeah, each country is very different. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't mean to oversimplify with this, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you did good. Thank you, Nat, for presenting on the Arab Spring. And yeah, we learned a lot. And I hope that we can continue talking about different events in the Middle East so we get a more diverse perspective on what's happening. Because I, for one, I think of it as a monolithic area, and it's definitely not in any sense.
Mhm.
So this will be a good opening topic for us.
Sure. For sure. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.